For us today, 1 Corinthians 9, and I want to read verses 19 to 27, although we'll talk about some verses before and after it. 1 Corinthians 9:19, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all so that I may win more. To the Jews I became as a Jew so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air. But I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. What should strike you in this passage is how many times he talks about winning souls and uses that specific term. That I may win more, that I may save some. The whole passage is summed up in that statement that I may win more. And Paul's purpose and passion was to be used by the Lord in that language to win souls. He saw it as a competition in which he was engaged by divine call. And surely he knew Daniel 12:3, those who lead many to righteousness will shine brightly like the stars forever and ever. And surely he knew Malachi 2:6, which declared that a faithful priest would turn many back from iniquity. And surely he knew Jeremiah 23:22, which states that true prophets sent by God would have turned them back from their evil way to fear the evil of their deeds. And surely he would have known Proverbs 11:30, he that wins souls is wise. And there's little doubt that he would have been familiar with the introduction of John the Baptist, the greatest Old Testament prophet and the forerunner of our Lord, of whom it was said, he will turn many of the sons of Israel back to the Lord their God. It is he who will go as a forerunner before him in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children and the disobedient to the attitude of the righteous, so as to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. And surely he knew, they must have been very familiar, these words from the lips of the Lord himself, words that are familiar to all of us. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. This is the mission of all believers. This was the mission of Paul, and this is your mission. At the end of all of this is the goal to save some, to win more. Building up the church is the means to that end. The building up of the church is not the end, it is the means to the end. This is the mission that we all have undertaken. And the objective and the goal can be simply stated as to win more, to save some. Now, accomplishing that goal, being used by God to do that, involves both an external and an internal, or an objective and a subjective element. The external objective reality is the content of the gospel. That is outside of us, but that is essential to this mission. So you look back at 1 Corinthians 9 and go back to verse 16, where he says, for if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion, For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. Why? Because only the gospel can save. That's why you have to get the gospel right. That's why Paul spent so much time in the epistles defending and explaining the essential elements of the gospel. So from an external, objective point of reality, we have to understand and proclaim the gospel. Paul says to the Romans, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God. It's the power and the power alone that saves. He explains the gospel throughout Romans. In particular, you're familiar with Romans chapter 3, where he lays out the gospel, and then in chapter 10, how will they hear unless they have a preacher to preach them the gospel? 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, he says, I'm determined to know nothing among you but Christ and him crucified. He says the preaching of the gospel may be foolishness to those who are perishing. That's a category of people, but it is life to those who are being saved. 2 Corinthians 5, he says we are ambassadors, we are delegates sent to the world to preach the gospel of justification by faith, the gospel of imputed righteousness. Galatians 1, he says if you preach any other gospel, you're damned. So from the objective standpoint, you must get the gospel right. This has certainly been a battle throughout my life to make sure that the people under my influence understood the real gospel in the midst of all kinds of truncated and false and counterfeit gospels. So preaching the gospel, Paul says, is essential. It is not something I do voluntarily. It is something that I am mandated to do. If I do it voluntarily, I have a reward, but if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. In other words, this wasn't my choice. I was basically commanded to preach the gospel. You will remember in Acts chapter 9 where that command first came to him to preach the gospel. And that's what's behind this passage, an understanding that if I'm going to preach the gospel, I want to make full use of my right in the gospel. In other words, I want to do everything I can in my own life to make sure I facilitate the effectiveness of the preaching of the true gospel. The true message of salvation, absolutely critical. And every generation fights for the sacredness of that, fights for the clarity of that, fights for the priority of that, and fights against all the things that will tear at the gospel and disassemble it. But there's another reality, and that's the reality that I want us to look at in this passage. Beside the external objective reality, there is the internal subjective reality. And this looks at what's going on in your heart and my heart. This is about attitude. This is about motive. This is about disposition. And this also lies at the heart of our usefulness in winning more people to Christ. And that is what concerns the apostles here. This is of grave concern. These two are inseparable. You have to get the gospel right, but your heart has to be right as well if you're going to be useful. I mean, you know, you're alive, you're aware of what's going on around us all the time. You have people who seem to have some kind of legitimate attitude, but the message is wrong. You have some people who have the message right and their hearts are not right. You can crash and burn on either count. But the context here is this, and this is what I want you to see. The Corinthians were interested in the issue of freedom. Freedom is a very popular word. People today even love that word, and we don't have a slave society. But the Corinthians were caught up in the potential realities of freedom. And they wanted to know, essentially, how much freedom do we have? Now that we've been set free in Christ, how much freedom do we have? And that was what Paul was talking about in chapter 8. We won't go back to it. You're familiar with it. And also in the earlier part of chapter 9. How free are we? Here's the basic question. How free are we to hang on to things from our past? How free are we to stay connected to the culture? How free are we to associate with the paganism out of which we have been delivered? Paul responds by saying this: you're asking absolutely the wrong question. If you're worried about your freedom, you're on a road to disaster. That is the wrong question. The issue on the table is not how free you are to connect with the world, but what freedoms could you sacrifice to reach them with the gospel? That's the discussion about freedom. Mark this: immature, self-centered, selfish Christians are always concerned about how much freedom they should have. That is a badge of immaturity, if not a badge of carnality, if not a cloak of maliciousness or sin. Mature, spiritual, loving Christians are always concerned about how many freedoms they can let go of to make the gospel more attractive. Lord, help me to always set aside any freedom that would hinder the gospel, hinder my witness, hinder my usefulness. And this commitment to unselfishness is very pervasive and very deep. Look at Paul's language in verse 19. Though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all so that I may win more. You can't say it in a more extreme way. Literally, he uses the term doulo. I enslave myself. I am free from all men in non-moral matters, but because of my love for the Lord and lost sinners, I have enslaved myself. That's the stunning choice of words. And he doesn't say I've enslaved myself to some. He says I have enslaved myself to all. He would set aside freedoms. He would modify habits. He would alter preferences. He would literally overturn his entire lifestyle if any of it hindered someone from hearing and being drawn to the gospel. Now, we all know that there are behaviors the Bible doesn't forbid. There are behaviors the Bible doesn't even speak about. We also know that we have been freed from traditions and from external things and from ceremonies. We are free in regard to those things. Free as long as we have a clear conscience. But Paul is saying love limits all those freedoms. Everything in Paul's life was under the control of love for the lost. He eagerly sacrificed for the sake of gospel witness. I enslave myself. That's how you have to look at your life. If you're going to preach the gospel, and you've been called to do that, and that's why you're here, you not only are a slave to Christ, you are going to be a slave to the lost. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 44, our Lord says, whoever wishes to be first among you shall be what? Slave of all. For even the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. That's the model to follow. You are virtually giving up your freedoms. I enslave myself. That is a very strong verb, doulao. It was used in Acts 7 to speak of the 400 years of Israel's bondage in Egypt. Putting myself in bondage. It was used of the marriage bond in 1 Corinthians 7:13. It was used in Titus 2:3 to speak of addiction to alcohol, which is a very serious kind of bondage. And most significantly, in Romans 6:18, it's used to speak of our new slavery to righteousness. So we, as those who preach the gospel, have been called not only to be slaves of Christ, but slaves in the sense that we set aside all our freedoms if in any case they would offend any unbeliever. And Paul will even go further than that and add even another weak believer as well. I think it needs to be established early in our ministry as we get going in this, that you're going to spend your life setting aside your freedoms. And that's how you need to understand your calling. Why? To win more. To save some. That sounds so Arminian. That sounds like a rebellion against Calvinism. It isn't that God is going to save some people he wouldn't otherwise have saved. It is that he's going to have to use somebody else. Not you. And what's the point of that? Why go into the ministry and end up not being useful? You might as well do something else. The subjective internal attitude for a useful gospel witness is self-denial. And to illustrate this sacrificial self-denial and self-imposed slavery, Paul gives three simple illustrations. In verse 20 is the illustration regarding the Jews. To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. Another way to say that, to those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law. He's talking about the ceremonial law, the external law, so that I might win those who are under the law. And there are some illustrations about that, aren't there? You think about Acts 21. Paul imposed upon himself some ceremonies that he didn't need to be bound to engage in, but he did that so as not to offend the Jews. And in the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, they made a very big point about that, right? You can't go out and offend the Jews and expect them to hear the gospel. You're going to have to conduct yourself in a way that is not blatantly and openly offensive. Paul says that this was driven, this willingness to sacrifice for the Jews, by the fact that he had such a passion for the Jews that it's expressed in the most dramatic way possible in the book of Romans, where he says he could almost wish himself damned for the salvation of his people Israel. He had such a passion for the salvation of Jews that he would make any sacrifice of any freedom, even his freedom from all the legalism, the externalism of Judaism, both that which prescribed by the Old Testament and that which had been added to the Old Testament, the hundreds and hundreds of traditions. He didn't need to do those, but he would conform himself at any point for the sake of not offending, to give a hearing to the gospel. And when it came to the Gentiles in verse 21, to those who are without law, without the written law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. What's the law of Christ? It's the law of love. I love the Gentiles. I'm not going to offend them. If meat offered to an idol offends my brother, I'm not going to eat that meat because I'm not going to offend my weaker brother. He talks about that. In chapter 8, verse 7, he says, not all men have this knowledge that an idol is nothing, but some, being accustomed to the idol until now, eat food as if it were sacrificed to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. And he goes on to say, look, I'll set aside anything. If food causes my brother to stumble, in verse 13, I'll never eat it again. And this is a general principle of self-sacrifice. And then in verse 22, the third category, to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. Notice, in each case, that I might win those, that I might win those, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. That verse has been twisted and misused endlessly, particularly in pragmatism, cultural forms of ministry. People make it to mean that if people like rock and roll, I'll give them rock and roll. That's not what it's saying. It is saying, I personally will sacrifice all my freedoms, if necessary, before I'll offend another person. And that may shift a little bit in cultures as time goes on, but the principle is the same. Always to win some, always to save some. The goal then, verse 23 sums it up. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Assume koinonos. You know what koinonia is. Partner, fellow partaker. I literally will sacrifice anything to bring people into the fellowship, to bring people into the family of Christ. There are many, many illustrations. You see them all the time, particularly in this contemporary society, of people in quote-unquote pastoral ministry, Christian ministry, evangelical ministry, who are consumed with their own lives, their own possessions, their own power, almost drunk on their own power, their wealth. Paul would be a pauper, if need be, to win someone else, to bring others into the fellowship. He would never allow himself or another Christian to use his freedom in any manner that would offend a sinner. Now, you can talk about all the ways in which this can be played out and illustrated. I just want you to get the text in your mind. How do you do this? How do you live a fully sacrificial life like this? It's not easy. It's not easy if you're going to win some, save some, win more, live for the sake of the gospel so that others can become partakers of it. How do you do that? That takes us to verses 24 to 27. And Paul acknowledges that this self-imposed slavery, this sacrificial living, is not easy. It is not easy. It requires effort. And so he speaks of that effort in athletic terms. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. We all know that athletics was a big thing. It really had been launched in that part of the world by Alexander the Great. Athletic games became wildly popular in the Mediterranean world. The most famous games we still identify are the Olympic Games. They are ancient games. They were the most famous. The second most famous, perhaps, was the Isthmian Games, which were conducted in Corinth, and the best that I can find was that they were conducted in Corinth every third year. Contestants had to show evidence of at least 10 months of intense training to be qualified. That was the initial qualifier, that you demonstrated that you had done 10 months of intense training for your event. Then if you were received, if your qualification was validated, you would go to the event 30 days before the event began, and you would go through 30 days of intense training under the scrutiny of those who conducted those games. And if you met all the conditions during those 30 days, you would then be allowed to participate. So you've got invested 11 months in this, and whatever was prior to that, a tremendous amount of investment. There would be only one winner who inevitably would be immortalized, and though it was a simple wreath, in the case of these games in Corinth, it would have been a pine wreath. It wasn't the wreath that had the value, it was the immortality that was attached to the wreath that had the value. So you did all that to win. You did all that to win. In those games, you got nothing for participating. There were no trophies for participants. Now, this is likened to the race that we're in. This is not a race for salvation. This is a race for usefulness. This is a race for winning souls. This is a race in which there can be many winners. And the prize is not salvation, but usefulness in winning the lost. And only those who have trained themselves for this and have met all the qualifications are going to win. Those who hold tightly to their freedoms will lose. And there's another contrast in verse 25. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. Why? They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. It's a matter of effort to win and to receive the prize. They do it to win a perishable wreath, we an imperishable. How amazing is that? How absolutely stunning is that? That the Lord would promise us, if we're faithful in the self-sacrifice that makes us useful to win souls, that we will receive a wreath, a prize that is everlasting. Daniel 12, we will literally shine as the stars forever and ever. What's required for this? Self-control. Verse 25, exercising self-control. The selfish and indulgent freedom lovers don't win. Neither do the abusers of grace. I've been reading a book by Nicholas Clagett from 1659. He wrote a book called Abuses of Grace. It's quite an experience to read it in the language of that day, and it's a first edition volume in and of itself, so it's very fragile. It is a rather difficult effort to make out the printing in some cases and to make yourself see what looks like an F and pronounce it as an S, and a whole lot of other things. But I've labored to read that book because I'm so deeply concerned about the abuses of grace that go on in the church, and particularly in Christian leadership. He bases the whole book on Jude, those who have crept in and turned grace into lasciviousness. That was a problem then, and the book is very direct. The dedication is to his cousin, and he basically says to him, you better get your act together and tell your wife to do the same thing. It's kind of a different approach to dedicating a book. Then he picks on everybody in the process of writing the book. We know something about this from other passages in 1 Corinthians, this kind of self-sacrifice, this kind of self-denial, this kind of self-control. Back in chapter 6, you're familiar with verse 12. All things are lawful for me. All things that are lawful, that aren't forbidden by God. But not all things are profitable. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. And then he goes on to give an illustration of even food. Even food. And then in chapter 10 and verse 23, he says, all things are lawful again, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things build me up, edify me. Hebrews 12:1, let us lay aside the sin, yes, but let us lay aside every weight and the sin that besets us. So the weight is other than the sin. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which besets us. Weight is ankos in the Greek. It just means bulk, mass. You don't run a 100-meter dash with an overcoat. It's not that it's wrong to do that, it's just stupid. It's not evil, it's just not helpful. And what he's saying in Hebrews, if you're going to run this race of faith, you need to get rid of the sin part of it, but you need to get rid of the rest of the stuff that just weighs you down. Whether it was Jews hanging on to Old Testament rituals, or Gentiles hanging on to idol traditions, or whether it's believers hanging on to the world, and the trappings of the world, and the entertainment of the world, and the idols of the world. God has offered you something eternal if you let that go. He's offered you an eternal prize, an imperishable prize. Run to win souls and run to win the prize. Nothing wrong with that. Now, in order to do that, Paul says, I've made that commitment. Verse 26, therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air. I run to win, I box to win. There's a manliness about that. I want the victory. I want the victory for the sake of the souls, and I want the victory because I've been offered an eternal reward. And in order to do that, I have to exercise self-control in all things. And that even includes, down in verse 27, I discipline my body. Verb means to hit something in the sense that you would hit someone maybe and give them a black eye. I punch my body. I beat it back. Fleshly impulses. And then this statement, and make it my slave. So he says, I am a slave to Christ. I am a slave to unbelievers. I make myself a slave to win them. And in order to do that, I have to make my body a slave to the will of God. This is a triple kind of slavery, isn't it? It would help us think humbly about ourselves. He makes himself a slave to Christ, a slave to all, and his body a slave to himself. On the positive side, he does this to win the divine prize, to be really immortalized, because the Lord will reward him for that kind of self-denial and usefulness in winning souls. But there's a negative side of that as well. And it's a warning at the end of verse 27. So that after I have preached to others, I myself would not be disqualified. Disqualified is also a word connected to those kind of events, right? We all know what it is to be DQ'd. I may be preaching to others, but wind up disqualified. There's no second place, there's no third place, there's no also-rans, there's no silver medal, there's no bronze medal. There's only two possibilities. You either win or you're disqualified. You either win or you're disqualified. Adakimas, found insufficient, wanting, lacking, inadequate. After I have heralded to others, I myself will not be disqualified. The word heralded is just that, to herald. And by the way, at those games there was a herald who was the announcer. The herald would come and announce the competitors, and then he would announce those who were disqualified, and then he would announce the winners. Paul didn't want to be on the list of the disqualified. So the fleshly, immature, selfish Corinthians thought they could indulge their freedoms thinking only of themselves and not others, while Paul, spiritual and mature and godly and virtuous, thought only of how he could set aside everything, become not only a slave to Christ, but a slave to all other people, and make his body a slave to him as well. He would sacrifice anything and everything so as not to hinder the gospel witness. And with that, you might think that Paul's message is over, but it isn't. Unfortunately, they put chapter 10 in there when this is just the rest of the same truth. So look at chapter 10. He has arrived here at the illustration of all of this. For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. DQ'd. Disqualified. 4, at the beginning of verse 1, is gar. Moreover, doesn't change the subject. And then you'll notice the word all 5 times. 5 times, all the Jews received all these benefits and all these privileges. All of them were under the cloud. All of them passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. All ate the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink. They all had the same privileges. They were all a part of the Exodus. They were all under the cloud that led them by day. They all walked through the Red Sea on dry land. They were all united with their leader in a solidarity. They all ate the same spiritual food. They were all given the manna in the wilderness. They all drank the same spiritual drink. They all received water in the desert by the provision of the Lord. What he is saying is here's an illustration. Here is a whole people that were delivered, like a picture of salvation. We're not saying they were all genuinely saved, but they are a picture of a people delivered. All called out of bondage, all set free, all commissioned to be a witness nation, all commissioned to be basically the treasurers of the revelation of God, to hold in trust divine revelation. They were all baptized into Moses. What does that mean? There are some bizarre interpretations of that. Baptized into Moses. All that means is they were united in him. They were immersed into him in solidarity because he was their leader. They were united as one people with Moses, God's appointed leader. Some people have suggested that they were sprinkled by the cloud. That's the Presbyterians. And others that they were baptized in the sea. But neither of those are correct because it's a glory cloud, not a rain cloud. And they walked through the sea on dry land. What this says is they were all part of a delivered people, all led out of bondage, all miraculously delivered, all united with one leader, God's appointed leader, all identified with the Lord and his work. They all had a common deliverance, led by God, by the cloud, through the sea, privileged people. Paul sees a parallel in this. Christians have all been delivered from bondage, genuinely, salvifically, all saved from sin and death and judgment, all united as one in the Lord Jesus Christ. The Jews were led by Moses toward the promised land of blessing as God's old covenant people. Christians are led to heaven as the promised land of blessing, new covenant saints. Yes, baptism symbolizes our union with Christ, and maybe the fact that he talks about eating and drinking even has an allusion to the communion table, because he even introduces Christ at that point, saying that the one who provided all this for them was Christ. This is an amazing set of privileges, miraculous privileges that the people of Israel enjoyed. And we all know the sad story. They were literally strewn, verse 5, in the wilderness. Their deliverance was great. Our deliverance is far greater. Our privileges are far greater. Our baptism is far greater. We are baptized into Christ. Our food is far greater. He is the bread of life. He is the water of life. The warning is most of them God was not well pleased with, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Numbers 14:16 says God slaughtered them. God slaughtered them. What a warning to be disqualified as a gospel witness. And then in verse 6 he says, now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Here was the problem. They were holding on to things from the past, the things of their pagan life. They were craving evil, epithumia kakos. They had strong desires for evil things. To avoid this abuse of grace in our case, to avoid this presumption of privilege and freedom, look at the sad story of the Jews being disqualified as witnesses. They clung to idolatry, verse 7. They clung to immorality, verse 8. They clung to rebellion. They rebelled, as we know, verse 9, Numbers 21. And in verse 10, complaining. By idolatry, immorality, rebellion, and complaining, they were devastated. And verse 10 ends with this: they were destroyed by the destroyer. Destroyed by the destroyer. Who's the destroyer? Numbers 16:45. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Get away from this congregation, that I may consume them instantly." God was the destroyer. God himself was the destroyer. He disqualified them. Now these things, verse 11, happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he what? Does not fall. You don't want to be DQ'd, do you? You didn't come here to end like that. You're not working as hard as you're working and being taught and cared for with this in view. And if you want to make sure this doesn't happen, then you have to make sure that you're eager to set aside your freedoms. You're eager to make whatever sacrifices are going to make the gospel more attractive, more believable, and are going to make you more useful. You say, well, I don't know if I can make it. Life's long. I'm at the other end. I can give you the view from the hearse. You may say, I don't think I can make it. There's a final word of good news. In verse 13, no temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man, and God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also,